The group that Pete mentioned that we wanted to be sure and give a shout out to here at the beginning is the Southern Extension Risk Management Education Center. That's a group that's located at the University of Arkansas, and they're actually the ones that gave us the grant funding to do the Ranchers Leasing handbook that we've written, the webinar today, and some upcoming programs that we have that you'll learn a little bit more about. So we sure appreciate their support of our work here today. I'll start off my presentation with a little disclaimer. I have to do this. I want to make sure everyone is aware today I am a lawyer, but I am not your lawyer. And so if you all have specific legal questions or need specific legal advice, I can't help too much with that, but I am sure happy to answer whatever questions I can and give you some general information that hopefully will be useful. Here's kind of a roadmap of what I'm planning on covering today. And it's a lot of information in a short amount of time, but we're going to start off with why written leases are necessary. Then we're going to look a little bit at setting payment rates. How much should you be charging and where can you get that information? Then we're going to cover what I like to call my father's favorite section. Then I'm going to offer some tips on grazing leases and hunting leases. And then I'm going to mention our upcoming ranchers leasing workshops. If you guys are listening today and you think, man, I'd like to see some more info on this, I'd like to go to a little bit more in-depth program, we've got 3 half-day workshops coming up this fall on these same topics. We just get to go into a lot more detail and take a lot more questions at those. We'll give you that information at the end of the program today. So let's kick things off and talk about why a written lease is necessary. When I first started my position here at Texas A&M, I would get phone calls and folks would say, hey, can you just send me the form that people use for a lease agreement, for a grazing lease? And I always kind of laugh because, gosh, a lot of people use something that looks a lot like this picture, right? Handshake deal, an oral agreement made by 2 guys standing in the middle of a pasture. One of them says, I'll lease my land to you for this much. They shake hands. They go about their business. You all may have some of those leases of your own, or I bet you know somebody who has one. So let's talk about that written lease agreement in the pasture. Is that a valid contract under Texas law? Think about that. You can discuss it kind of amongst yourselves. I know some of y'all are here in groups. The answer to that is the answer that I like to give to any legal question. Any good lawyer answers a legal question as it depends. Let's look at how that works. So the general law here in Texas and in most states across the country is that an oral contract is valid. So generally, oral contract valid in Texas, but here in our state and in most states around the country, there's something called the Statute of Frauds. Every state may be a little bit different, but generally they're pretty similar. And what the Statute of Frauds often says, and this is Texas is written here, is look at that second bullet. It says a lease of real estate that lasts a year or more must be in writing in order to be enforceable. So what that means is if you're going to enter into a 2, 3, 5-year lease agreement, for that to be a valid legal contract, it actually does have to be in writing. Now, you might think to yourself, why do I care if I have a valid legal contract? Well, if you ever end up in a dispute and you have to go to court, the type of claim you're going to want to make is probably going to be breach of contract. And guess what the first thing you're going to have to prove is to succeed on that claim? The existence of a contract. Okay, so like I say, if you're entering into a long-term lease agreement, want to make sure we have those in writing. The second reason written contracts are important is the exercise of writing it down is helpful. Listen, if you sit down with a pencil and a piece of paper and start jotting out terms to a lease, you're going to think of a lot more things to include or a lot more questions to address than you will just standing in that pasture talking back and forth. And so just the exercise of writing it down brings in some additional detail that can be really useful. The third point I want to make is that if you end up in court, you're going to want a written document. Listen, court is hard enough to predict what a judge or a jury is going to do under the best of circumstances. So you're a lot better off trying to sort of analyze your rights and decide if you've got a valid claim, if you've got a written piece of paper, instead of kind of a he said, she said dispute in front of a judge. The fourth point is that there may be other folks that require a written lease to be produced. The most common place we see this is at the FSA office. That's Farm Services Agency, for those of you that might not be familiar. These are our county government offices where you go in, and this is where you sign up for things like payments under the Farm Bill or certain different types of programs that are offered. If you've got a lease agreement on a property, particularly for the Farm Bill, if you're going to get ARC or PLC payments, they're going to want a copy of a lease for their files in order to enroll you for those programs. So that's one example of where that might be important. A second example is at the NRCS office. That's the Natural Resource and Conservation Office. That is where, again, you would register for certain programs. Those are going to be things more like, CRP, EQIP, those type of, I guess, more rangeland type programs. They may require a copy of a lease as well. The third place you may come across this is your county appraisal district. At least here in Texas, there are certain county appraisal districts that want copies of lease agreements if you're trying to maintain or get special use tax valuation. And that we could spend a whole hour talking just about that, but that's another example of where having a written lease may be important. The fifth point I'm going to make here, I'm going to use this photograph to illustrate. The guy on the bay horse in the denim shirt is my dad. He's been involved in agriculture his entire life. He has been a landlord, he's been a tenant, have lots of lease agreements. He's the kind of guy that if you have a handshake deal with, you'll probably be okay. The guy on the gray horse is my city boy cousin from Switzerland. He is 40 years old. That was his first time on a horse. And he went home and told all of his friends he rode Seabiscuit. Now, if you take a look at that picture, Sarge there has probably not run a step since 1985, okay? Here's my point. If you have an oral lease with my dad, you probably aren't going to have many problems. But heaven forbid something were to happen to my dad and the land gets inherited by my Swiss cousin. And now you're in a binding agreement, right? A legal relationship with someone who doesn't have a clue about the industry you're involved in. He doesn't understand what we do or why we do it or what's standard. I promise in that type of situation, you're going to want a written agreement to govern your relationship with that new landlord you could have. All right. So that's kind of our first section on why written leases are important. One thing I want to mention, if y'all have questions as we go, feel free to type them there in the chat box. Pete's going to kind of keep an eye on those, and then I'll try to answer them as we go, potentially, and for sure at the end. So if you have questions, feel free to type them in. The next section we'll talk about is calculating payment. This is one I get a lot of questions on. How do we set up a lease? What should we charge? How should this work? For agricultural leases, the most common arrangements, there's kind of three ways you normally see an ag lease structured. The first is a cash lease. And a cash lease agreement is by far the most common in agriculture, particularly when we're dealing with grazing leases. It's also the most straightforward. So normally the way that would be structured is you would set it up as either a flat fee. Sometimes we see it done per head. So you would pay so much per head for your cattle or your sheep or whatever. Or you might see it done per acre. I'm going to guess that per acre is probably the most common, a certain rate per acre. So that's a cash lease. The second type of lease that we see more common in row crop situations. So if you were leasing your land to a farmer that was going to grow cotton or corn or something, is a crop share lease. And that's just what it sounds like. You've got the tenant and the landlord, and they share in certain expenses. and then they share in certain the profits that are made as well. And how those are structured exactly depends on what you're dealing with, the type of crop or the type of lease. And so that is something to be aware of. Like I say, more common with farm leases, but you could set up a grazing lease like this as well. The third type of lease is kind of a combination of the first two. It's called a flex lease, or sometimes they call it a hybrid lease. And what you'll see there is they sort of set a base price. So let's say we're going to lease you the land for $25 an acre. But if the price of whatever commodity is being grown, so let's say the price of corn gets above $4, then the lease is going to flex up, or the lease could flex down and decrease the payment. So basically what happens in those is there's an outside factor. Usually it's going to be like I say, a price, a market price, or it's going to be a yield that'll flex that lease up or down. I normally tell people which one of these you choose. There's not a magic answer. You just want to make sure that whatever agreement you choose, you make it very clear that exactly how that's going to play out. Make sure you spell out the details so everyone's on the same page. The other point that I'd like to make here is that your choice of how you structure a lease may impact you other places. At the FSA office, the way they pay out their program payments depends on the type of lease you have. Who gets the money depends on the type of lease. It may affect you with the IRS and Social Security as far as self-employment income and your Social Security income. So what I recommend for folks is take a look at if you're entering into a new lease or you're looking at changing it, take a look at how that might affect you. And I'd visit with your accountant for sure, just to make sure that that won't be an issue somewhere else. So how much should I charge? If you have property and you're looking to lease it, or if you're a tenant and you're looking to try and figure out how much you should be paying for property, what do you do? Super helpful lawyer answer again is going to be, it depends, right? And it does depend on the facts of the situation. The first advice I would give you is talk to people on the ground. Talk to your local county extension agent. Here in Texas, we have a presence extension does in all of the counties in Texas. If you don't have an ag agent in your county, there's somebody next door that can help you. There's other extension resources. Pete mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that there are extension range specialists located around the state. Those folks are great. They're super helpful on figuring out maybe the quality of your grass, how much forage you have. They can kind of help you figure out stocking rates, which we'll talk about in a minute. We also have economists. Texas A&M has district economists scattered throughout the state that can help with this. So there's lots of great free resources through extension to be aware of. The other thing I recommend is go to the coffee shop, man, visit with some of the other landowners and producers in your area and see what are they charging, what are they paying. Those folks kind of that are on the ground are going to be the ones with the best information. I'm going to offer you 3 published sources of data. These are published every year. The first one, and I'll walk through a couple of them with you. The first one is that the USDA National Ag Statistics Service does a report every year. They do a survey of landowners and producers and publish average lease rates around the country. The second one is, at least for here in Texas, is called the Texas Rural Land Value Trends Report. That's put together by our Society of Rural Appraisers and Farm Managers. They do a great job with that. And then Texas A&M Ag Econ Department puts together some budgets every year. You can look those up on the website. They're spreadsheets, and they'll each have a line item in there for lease, and that's the average lease for your particular crop and area. So let's look at a couple of these, and I'll kind of show you the information you could get your hands on. The first one are those USDA NASS reports. These are available on the USDA website, but I will make y'all an offer right now. If you have trouble finding those, let me know. I'm going to give you my contact info at the end of this webinar. That website can be kind of a bear to navigate. If you have trouble and you need info, let me know and I will pull it for you. Okay? So with that, they break everything down by state. So they have this information for all 50 states if any of you are listening from somewhere else. And so for 2017, I pulled the statewide averages for Texas. You'll see here pasture land was $6.60 an acre. All of these are reported as per acre per year. Okay, so pasture land $6.60 per acre per year, non-irrigated cropland 28, and irrigated cropland 87. Now, statewide averages is not super helpful because there's a lot of different parts of Texas. So they break it down also into regions. The region map you see here on the right-hand side of the screen shows you those regions. I pulled statistics for a few just to give you an example. If you're up in the Panhandle, you're in the Northern High Plains region. Here's the numbers for that. 720 for pasture land, 3150 for non-irrigated cropland, and 139 for irrigated cropland. Since I think we may have some folks from other parts of the state, I'm going to put these all up quickly here. And I just pulled some of the more common ones where I get questions from. The Edwards Plateau region is number 70. That covers a lot of the hill country. You can look at those numbers here. Pasture land, non-irrigated cropland, irrigated cropland. The Blackland region is number 40. You'll see that over here. That kind of extends from kind of central Texas up to the Red River. The South Central region is number 81. That's going to be kind of down maybe around the College Station area. And then I pulled the Southeast region. That's number 52. And that's going to be what I like to call over in the trees in East Texas. So those will at least give you an idea. But like I say, they're available for every region. I'll help you find them if you have trouble. They also break it down by county. So you can go in and look at your specific county as well. And take a look at that. The new report, they come out every September. So in September, we'll have the 2018 numbers. And I'll make sure I do a post about that on my blog that you can follow along and see when that comes out. The second thing I want to mention is the Texas Rural Land Value Trends Report. You can Google that and it will pop up. If you have any trouble, I'll send it your way. What they do, as you'll see here, is they break the state into, I think it's 7 regions. So this here, and I just pulled one as an example. This here is a region kind of around Houston, okay? And then they break it into sub-regions. So every color here is a sub-region. And for each sub-region, they do a report. And so what you'll see here is, all the different sub-regions. Look at that Brazos Bottom region. It's going to give you different categories of land. So we have irrigated cropland, dry cropland, improved and native pasture, and then it gives you the value. So that would be sales price, market value. And then it also gives you the rental ranges. So again, here we have a range versus a set number like the NASS data. But this is very useful as well. So feel free to Google it and get your hands on that report. Okay, that's all I have on setting prices today. Like I say, in our leasing workshops that are half a day, we go into some more detail there, but hopefully that's at least an overview of some useful resources. The next section we're going to go to, I like to call my father's favorite section. A little bit about my dad. You saw him in a photo earlier. Like I said, he's been involved in agriculture his entire life. For the last 9 years, he has had free legal advice in the form of his daughter, with a law degree. We don't have all of our lease agreements in writing, and I have preached and preached until I'm blue in the face. And there's that scripture in the Bible about how Jesus wasn't a prophet in his hometown. I understand. Okay, about a year ago, my dad calls and he says to me, we're going to lease the place across the road, and I'm going to let you write up a written lease. Miracle had occurred. Okay? But then he follows up with, I don't want all your legal crap in there. You get 1 page. Any of you guys like my dad? I know there are some of you out there, okay? So what did I do? Well, I wrote up a 1-page lease. Does it have everything that I would want in there? No. Is it better than the nothing we had before? You bet. All right, so my point here is having something is going to almost always be better than nothing. It doesn't have to be, a super technical legal document that lawyers work on for hours. Something's better than nothing. All right. So I call this my father's favorite section because this is all the legal crap he wouldn't let us put in his lease agreement. The first thing that you want to cover in a lease is the issue of assignments or subleasing. And so if I lease my grazing property to Pete, could he then sublease it to someone else? Under Texas law, the answer is no. You can't sublease without permission from the landowner. But unless you've taken the bar exam, you may not know that. All right. And so I think it's always a good idea to include in the lease, if you're a landowner, there will be no assignments or subleasing without the landowner's permission. And that just takes care of that there. Everyone's on the same page. The next thing to think about is a forum clause. This comes into play if you're leasing to somebody who's maybe not from around where you live. For example, if I'm leasing to my neighbor, I don't need a forum clause. But sometimes we lease out hunting on our place. And a couple of years ago, we had a guy come up from Houston. That's the situation where you want a forum selection clause. And what the forum clause does is it will say any dispute under this lease will be heard in blank county. I live in Carson County. So we would say any dispute under this lease will be heard in Carson County, Texas. Two reasons for that, okay? Number one, I don't want a lawsuit filed in Houston and then I have to drive back and forth for hearings. Number two, I want home court advantage if we end up having to pick a jury or if we're dealing with a judge, okay? So like I say, not necessary in every lease, but if you're leasing to somebody who's from a different county or a different area, it might be something to think about. The third consideration is a dispute resolution clause. What this is, basically it says that in the event of a dispute before you go to court, you're going to agree to go to some form of dispute resolution. I will tell you that I'm a big fan of dispute resolution. I think it's very useful. In my mind, any way we can resolve court disputes outside of court is probably better because going to court is expensive, it takes forever, and a lot of times nobody feels like a big winner at the end. Dispute resolution would let you resolve your issues another way. Just make sure that when you agree to dispute resolution, you understand what it is you're agreeing to. There are a couple of different types. The first one is going to be mediation. Another one is called arbitration. All right, and so for mediation, that basically is where the plaintiff and the defendant go sit down with a neutral mediator and they try to come to a resolution. If they both agree to settle the case, they write it up and they've settled. If they don't both agree to settle the case, in that situation, mediation just failed and they can go file their lawsuit in the courthouse the next day. Arbitration looks different. All right, arbitration is where you go in and the plaintiff presents his case, the defendant presents his case, and the arbitrator is going to pick a winner. They act like a judge. The kicker there is that if you don't like the arbitrator's result, in most cases, you can't appeal that. You don't get to go to court and kind of have your day in court. You've traded that for your day in arbitration. Okay, so keep that in mind. The fourth thing you want to think about is an attorney fee provision. Attorney fees, the general rule in America is win, lose, or draw, each party pays for their own attorney fees. You can change that by contract. And so what you could write into a contract is that in the event of a dispute, each party will pay, in the event of a dispute, the prevailing party can recover his or her attorney fees. And that may be something to think about because it's probably not super shocking to you all that lawyers are expensive, okay? So keep that in mind as well. The next two things that you want to have in every lease kind of go together, and that is a liability clause and an indemnification clause. These are very important, and I recommend them whether we're talking grazing leases, hunting leases, farm leases, livestock leases like a bull or a ram. You want to have these clauses in there. What a liability clause says is that one party is not liable for the acts of another, and vice versa. So basically, the tenant's not liable for the acts of the landlord and the flip in return. The indemnification clause goes kind of one step further and says, in the event that we are sued because of the act of the other person, the person who caused the lawsuit, whether it's the landlord or the tenant's action caused the lawsuit, will hold the other harmless. That means they'll pay for their attorney fees and they'll cover any judgment against them. Okay? Very important clauses to include. Let's look at some grazing lease pointers. If you're going to enter into a grazing lease, what are some of the key terms you want to have? And I saw a question in the chat box, and I'll mention this now anyway, is we are hitting the high notes on all of this stuff. We've got a whole handbook that I'm going to tell you about at the end of the program that goes into much more detail on the different kinds of leases. We've got some sample clauses. We've got a checklist of terms. Like I say, we just only have time to hit the high notes today, so that's what we're doing. Okay. Things to consider in a grazing lease. The number one thing I would tell a landowner entering into a grazing lease is to set a stocking rate. Stocking rate, what is that? Very simply, you just limit the number of animals that can be on the property. From a landowner perspective in a grazing lease, you want to protect your land, right? That's your asset. And so what you don't want to do is lease your property for a year, and at the end of the year, the tenant has, put every cow he's ever seen out there, ruin the grass, graze it into the ground, and now you've got property that you can't lease because there's just no forage left. The best way to protect from that is to set a stocking rate. When you set those, they can either be done, generally what we see is per head, or using an animal unit measurement. What the heck is an animal unit? What that is it's a way to take into consideration the size of the animal when you're setting a rate. For example, let's say that we said you can run 50 cows on our property. Would it matter to you as a landowner if the tenant had 50,000 pound Angus cows or 50 1,500 pound Charolais cows? Yeah, it might, right? Those larger cattle may require more forage in order to maintain. And so what you can do here is use an animal unit, and you could say you're allowed to run 50 animal units on the property. For cattle, one animal unit is 1,000 pounds. So a 1,000-pound cow is 1. A 1,500-pound cow is 1.5. All right? So that's one way to look at that. In that handbook that I mentioned, there are going to be, there's a little chart in there because they have these different measurements for different types of animals. I think horses are included, sheep and goats. I know for sheep, it's about 6 sheep as one animal unit. So that'll be in that handbook if anybody needs that as well. A couple of things to think about when setting that stocking rate. And again, this is where your county agent or the extension range specialist for your area can be very helpful. But one thing to think about is make sure that you look into what your county appraisal district rules may be for open space or ag use valuation. Okay, take a look at that because and every county appraisal district is different in the state of Texas. But they may have a rule that says you have to run so many cows per acre to qualify for that special use valuation. And I don't know if you guys have ever looked at your tax bill to see the difference in the property taxes you pay for regular valuation or your special use valuation, but it's huge. So just double check with your appraisal district before you set that stocking rate. The other thing to keep in mind that most of us know all too well is that this number may have to change based on drought or wildfire. If you know, look, for example, back home, we usually try to run a cow for every 30 acres or so. I will promise you, back in 2012, for example, nobody was running a cow to every 30 acres, okay? Or we think about the fires that came through the Panhandle last year. Once that happened, everything changed for anybody who was affected by those. And so it's a good idea to have some information in your lease that talks about, especially if you have a long-term lease, that talks about, hey, we may need to reevaluate this. So for example, if you're going to lease it for 3, 4, 5 years, I would say at least on a yearly basis, maybe even more often, it's a good idea to kind of sit down and reevaluate and see if that stocking rate needs to change. If you want to do that, you can sure look at that and see, you know, how to deal with that in the lease agreement, but include something in there for that. I see over here in the comments, someone mentions that the NRCS may also be helpful in trying to figure out the amount of grazable acres and the stocking rate. Absolutely agree. That's a great resource that folks need to be aware of. The second tip I'll give is you need to address in your lease what can be done on the property. What I like to tell people is basically if you don't include limitations, they don't exist. Okay, so for example, if I'm going to lease my property to Pete and we both know he's going to graze cattle, but our lease says, I agree to lease my land to Pete, period. If I don't have a limitation in there that says for use for grazing cattle only, we may have a problem. Because without that limitation, Pete may come out and, have his grandkids ride horses or have his kids ride four-wheelers or bring all his buddies out to, whatever. You want to make sure you have those type of limitations written into your lease agreement. Are there any areas that are off limits to the tenant? So maybe you're going to lease your property and you're going to lease them to pasture, but you don't want them using them per corral or not using them the corrals. Okay. So if you want to have any sort of limits like that, make sure you expressly include those in the lease. The next thing I'll say, and this comes up all the time here in Texas, is save yourself a tent situation in November. Usually, at least here in the Panhandle, the kind of that first week in November, a lot of times is opening week of deer season. Okay, and what you want to do is make sure in any sort of grazing or ag lease you do, you address expressly which party has the hunting rights. Okay, because I say this all the time and I mean it. Something happens when deer season hits and everybody who's ever set foot on your property is trying to come up with some reason they should get to hunt there. All right? You don't want to be addressing this issue with your tenant and all of his friends over the fence when we have firearms in our hands. Much better to address it sitting down with a piece of paper and a pen so we know who has those hunting rights and whether or not they can lease them out to other people. The third situation I'll mention is maintenance of fixed assets. Include a term in your lease agreement that says who's going to maintain and repair assets during the lease. These are going to be things like fences, windmills, pumps. If they go out or you have trouble during the lease term, who's going to maintain those? You can write that however you want. There's no magic way to do it. I'll tell you back home where I grew up, what we normally do is we have the tenant pays for the labor and the landowner pays for the materials. That's just one example. You could do it however you want. But address it because there's something kind of magical about a lease agreement being signed and then all of a sudden something breaks. It just seems to happen a lot and it's problematic. Okay, so keep that in mind. For fences, I like for landowners to include a term that requires periodic inspection and immediate repair of fences if there's any damage. That can be a useful thing for folks if you're dealing with if livestock were to get out and someone gets injured or something like that. Landowners being able to point to the lease and say, hey, the tenant was the one who had this obligation can be useful. On that note, and we don't have time to go super in depth on this, a landowner is generally not going to be liable for injuries that happen on the property during the term of the lease unless they deal with repairs. So if you're a landowner and you promise to make repairs and don't, or you promise to make repairs and do a bad job, you could be liable for that, but you're generally not liable for any other sort of injury that occurs on the property. And like I said, we could talk about this forever, but we just don't have time to get too far into that today. So those are my kind of key tips on grazing leases. Like I say, we've got much more in our checklist in the book I'll mention in a few minutes. Let's turn to hunting leases. If you're going to be leasing your property for hunting, what are some key considerations to keep in mind? The first thing is that I want everyone coming on the property to sign a lease and sign a couple of liability waivers. Okay, here's what I would tell you. The first thing is I want everyone hunting to sign a lease. And I know that this isn't super common. So for example, what you might see is I lease my land to Pete for hunting. Pete comes by the house and signs a hunting lease, but then he brings 4 of his buddies with him. Those guys haven't signed a lease. And here's the problem. I can't hold them to the provisions of a lease, and I can't sue them for breach of contract unless I have a contract with them. So I like for anyone coming on the property to sign a lease agreement with me. And in order to make sure that happens, I like a term in a hunting lease that says that the tenant has to have, only the lessee can come on the property, and anybody who wants to come with him has to be approved in writing by the landowner. And what that does as the landowner, right, that makes sure I know who's coming, and it lets me get the paperwork I want from them. Okay, so number 1, I want everybody to sign a lease. Number 2, I want to get 2 releases, or they're sometimes called liability waivers, before people enter the property. The first one's just kind of a standard waiver of liability. Here in Texas, the law says they have to be express and conspicuous. So I would not bury them in my hunting lease. I'd have a separate, document that's a liability waiver. I would make sure to have my attorney write that up for me. The law on that is kind of tricky. You want to make sure you're complying with it. And the second thing I would do is I would have folks sign the language from the Texas Agritourism Act. That's a fairly new statute that we're going to talk about in just a minute, but there's some language in there that you can have folks sign on a waiver to offer you limited liability. So I want everybody coming on the property to sign all 3 of these. Now here's where, right, I'm hearing my dad in my ear saying, I'm not going to make our neighbor who's hunted on our property for my whole life, sign a lease. Well, okay, look, the lawyer in me wants everybody to sign it. I understand the real world, there may be some exceptions. You're going to have to decide for yourself where you're comfortable. What I would offer is anybody paying you money needs to sign these documents, and anybody who you don't know real well needs to sign them. Okay? So that's what I would say, trying to, be lawyer versus, regular person. Okay? There's a question here, Anne. I see that you're asking about the language from Chapter 75A, which is the Agritourism Act. You asked if that could be included in your hunting lease or if it should be a separate document. I would make it a separate document. I tell folks, we'll talk about it in a minute, I tell you to print it on a separate piece of paper, just that paragraph, and have people sign it. I don't think you want to have it included in your hunting lease. Okay, the second thing in a hunting lease, you may want to think about limitations on certain hunting methods. Things like, can people use tree stands? Can they use deer blinds? Can they put out feeders? If they can, when can they access the property to put them out? When can they go and get them off? Do they need to be off by a certain time? So just kind of keep those details in mind. Are there certain types of weapons that may be prohibited? Well, that's going to depend on what you want, right? Maybe you want bow hunters, maybe you don't. Take a look at that and just kind of see. Can ATVs be used on the property? Do you want them to be allowed to use four-wheelers or the, mules or whatever they're called? Think about that. There's not a right or a wrong answer. Just make sure you address it in the lease if you want to put a limitation. ATVs brings up a good point, and that is insurance. I did some research, and actually the reports are that ATV accidents are the #1 cause of injury for people that are hunting. So I thought that was interesting. I wasn't aware of that, but that's what they say. Every landowner needs to have a liability insurance policy. I don't think there are exceptions to that. Okay, how much coverage you have is going to depend on the activity on your property, but you need to have a policy, and you need to make sure that policy addresses and covers everything you're doing on the land. So for example, if you have a farm liability policy, double check that it covers paid hunters that might be coming out. Just double check anything you're doing on the property is covered by that insurance policy. The third thing you want to do is describe the leased property and any limitations. I really like for hunting leases to include a map. A lot of times your hunters may not be super familiar with your land like you are. Go to Google Earth, print off a map. You can do that for free. Take a highlighter and highlight around the property, right? Here's where you can hunt. Identify anything they might need to be aware of, right? Here's a house or here's a barn. Mark those. Identify any sort of dangerous conditions that may exist. If you've got like an old abandoned well, mark that on there so they know where it is, okay? That can be quite useful. The next thing I would address is where can the property be entered? Is there a certain gate you want folks coming in and out of? That can be really important if you've got multiple hunters, something to just think about including. Is anybody else going to have rights? This becomes important, and there's really no legal requirement to do this, but I think it's just common sense and being a good landlord, a landowner. If you've got multiple tenants, make sure and tell them about each other. So if you've got a hunting lessee and you also have a grazing lessee, make sure they know, hey, there's going to be somebody else out there. He has permission to be there. What you don't want is one of them chasing the other one off with a gun, and then you've got big trouble. Okay, so just think about that as well. If you are leasing for hunting to somebody who you don't know well, okay, like the guy from Houston I mentioned earlier, we had never met him. He came up to hunt. We required a security deposit in that situation. Just like you would with an apartment, right? $200, $500, whatever it is, you take that money, and as long as they don't tear something up, fine, they get it back. But if they do, you've got some money here to help you deal with that situation. So that's something to consider as well. We're going to cover this quickly here because we're going to run out of time. If you are a landowner in the state of Texas, the Texas Parks and Wildlife requires you as a landowner, to have a hunting lease license. If you're going to lease out your land for hunting and you obtain anything of value in return. So if I'm going to lease my land to somebody and they're going to pay me to come hunt, under Texas regulations, I have to have a hunting lease license from Texas Parks and Wildlife. If you don't have one, it's a Class C misdemeanor. It can be a $500 fine. There are 3 types of licenses you can get. A hunting lease license, almost everybody, that's what they would get. You could get a cooperative license if a group of landowners kind of pools their property together. That can cheapen it up a little bit. Or you could get a Wildlife Management Association license. That one you've got to go through Parks and Wildlife, and they've got to look at your property and decide that it's somewhere where observing and collecting data might be useful, and then they have the right to do that, okay? For a regular hunting lease license, the cost, if you're less than 500 acres, is $79. If you're between 500 and 1,000 acres, it's $147. And if you're over 1,000 acres, it's $252 a year. So just beware of that. If you Google this, or I can send it to you if you need it, there's a real useful PDF that Parks and Wildlife put together that sets out this info. The last thing we're going to talk about, and I see your question, I'm going to get there, okay, is complying with limited liability statutes. Most states, not all, but most, have some form of limited liability statutes that works in favor of a landowner. And what these statutes do is, if you comply with the statutes, then you receive limited liability. So if somebody gets injured, they have a higher burden of proof. They have additional things they have to prove in order to recover. All right. In Texas, we have a recreational use statutes. These are pretty common throughout the country. Most states have them. They're all different in the details, though, so check your state. And we also have the more recent Texas Agritourism Act. I'm going to walk you through these. We're going to have to go kind of quick. If you've got more questions, there's a chapter that discusses all of these in the book. And they also have the copies of the actual statute printed in there as well. The Texas Recreational Use Statute says that a landowner is only liable for intentional acts or gross negligence if certain conditions are met. Okay, that's a much higher standard. The plaintiff that was injured would have to prove that the landowner or the tenant, this applies to tenants as well, okay, is either acted intentionally or acted with gross negligence, which is a much higher standard than regular negligence, okay? You can get this limited liability if you meet 3 requirements. The first one is if you have land. So this can apply to any land. There's a few more protections that apply to agricultural land, and that's what we're talking about today. So if you have agricultural land, that is land suitable for growing crops, raising livestock, or forestry. Suitable for, you don't have to be doing it. Okay? The second requirement is the plaintiff had to be there for a recreational purpose. The statute has a very broad definition that does include hunting. Okay, hunting, fishing, hiking, biking, riding four-wheelers, water sports. And then it says, and any other activity associated with enjoying the outdoors. Okay, so we have land. The plaintiff is there for a recreational purpose, and then you can choose any one of the next 3. Okay, here's our options. The first thing is if the landowner does not charge a fee, the statute applies, right? So if we have ag land, a hunter comes on our property, we don't make him pay. The recreational use statute applies and we get that limited liability. The second option is if the total charges for the past calendar year for all recreational use is less than 20 times the amount of ad valorem taxes last year, you can get the protection. What you do there is you get 2 columns. Add up how much money you made from recreational users on your property in 2017. Anybody that paid you to hunt or fish, get a total. Add up the total amount of property taxes you paid anywhere in Texas, not just where people hunt, any property taxes, get a total. As long as the income is not 20 times higher than the taxes, the statute can apply. Okay? The third option is if you carry a certain level of insurance, the statute applies regardless of whether you charge or not. So if you have a policy that has coverage of at least $500,000 a person, $1 million per occurrence of injury, and $100,000 per property damage, if you carry that level of coverage or higher, the limited liability applies. Okay? And I see your question, do they have to be paying customers? No. Okay? As long as you meet one of the 3 monetary requirements, it applies. All right? So again, you got to have ag land, the plaintiff is there for a recreational purpose, and then any of the 3 requirements there with the yellow dots. Okay? I love this statute. You don't have, nobody has to sign a piece of paper. No signs have to be hung up. It just happens. All right. Next up, the Agritourism Act. This act is a little bit newer, but it's very useful, I think, for all rural landowners. What it says is that an agritourism entity is not liable if a plaintiff is on agricultural land for a recreational or educational purpose, and the landowner has either hung up a sign or obtained a sign release. An agritourism entity is super broadly defined as anybody engaged in providing an activity on ag land for a recreational or educational purpose, regardless of compensation. Sounds to me like anybody who's coming to hunt, lets people come hunt, qualifies as an agritourism entity. So this works if you have agricultural land. That is defined as land that is suitable for growing crops or raising livestock. Broad definition. It applies to anyone who's there for a recreational or educational purpose. The recreational purpose definition is the exact same as that Recreational Use Statute, so it includes hunting. This one also includes educational purposes. So if you've got 4-H'ers coming out, or if you've got somebody coming out for a field day, it looks like this statute would probably cover that. Okay, so you've got two options if you want this statute to apply. You either hang up a sign or you get a release signed. The sign needs to look like this. I copied this right from the statute. You got to hang it at a clearly visible location on or near the premises where an agritourism activity is conducted. For hunters, I say hang it on the gate, right at the gate where they come in and out. You could get this printed yourself, or everybody sells them. Texas and Southwest cattle raisers, sheep and goat raisers, Farm Bureau, Texas Wildlife Association. They're those plastic blue signs that cost like 10 bucks. Okay, so that's your first option, hang up a sign. The second option is you can have somebody sign a release. It has to be signed before the activity by the participant or their parent, guardian, or managing conservator. A managing conservator is a custodial parent. Okay, it needs to be a document separate from any other agreement other than a different warning, consent, or assumption of risk. And that right there is why I would not put this in my hunting lease. I would print it on a separate piece of paper, okay? And you have to print it and it has to be at least 10-point bold font. I don't know who makes these rules, but that's what they said, okay? Here's the language. Again, I copied and pasted it right from the statute. I'd have this on a piece of paper. I would make everyone sign it. All right? The question of which one is better. Well, the lawyer in me says do both, but you sure don't have to. All right? The benefit of the sign is you just hang it up and go on. You don't have to, track people down and make them sign a piece of paper. I think the benefit of the release comes into play if you have a minor coming on your property. A minor is anybody under 18, okay? Generally, under Texas law, courts have not enforced liability releases against minors. So if you've got a parent that signs a liability release for their minor child, courts in Texas generally don't enforce those. It's the same in Oklahoma. They just don't like doing that. However, look at this slide and the italic language. This statute expressly says it could be signed by a participant or their parent, guardian, or managing conservator. I think that's at least a pretty good argument that the legislature intended for this release, this signed piece of paper, to be able to waive claims of a minor child. We've not seen a case on it, okay? This is still a fairly new statute. It was passed in 2015. But I think this is your best bet for protecting yourself from liability if a child is injured on your property doing a recreational or educational activity. Okay, the other thing there is there's a whole list of exceptions. We're not going to go through those. The lawyers will fight about whether they apply or not. I always tell people at least have the option to have that argument, hang up the sign or get the release. Okay? This is probably how you all feel now. No hunting, no fishing, no nothing, go home. Anybody? I'm sorry, okay? The last thing I want to mention is some additional resources. The first one is that Ranchers Agriculture Leasing Handbook I've been mentioning. That's available for free through me. So I'm going to give you my contact information here at the end. You can download a PDF on my website, or heck, if you guys want a hard copy, call me or email me. I will mail you a copy in the mail, or I'll shoot you a copy by email. Just let me know, okay? The other website that's really useful is called Ag Lease 101. That was put together by some extension folks up in the Midwest. It focuses more on farm leases, those row crop type leases, but they've got some great information on there as well, aglease101.org. Okay, so if this was fun, if you think I might need to come to one of these that lasts a little longer, where she can talk slower, I probably won't talk slower. I could talk slower. And we'll be there for about half a day. We've got 3 events coming up this fall. These are free. You just have to get in touch with me to get your name on the list, okay? The first one's going to be in Bryan College Station on September 7th. That's going to be from noon to 4. We'll start out with a free lunch sponsored by Ag Workers Insurance, and then we'll have our program. Guys, if you're an Aggie fan, that is a Friday before the Clemson game on Saturday. So if you want to come down, you can go to the leasing workshop. You can hit up our Ag Economics tailgate the next day. And then if you can get tickets, you can go to the game. So keep that one in mind. The second event's going to be in Fort Worth. It's going to be at the Cattle Raisers building on a Tuesday, September 18th from 1 to 5. You can register for that one online, or you can get me your info and I'll get you signed up there. The third option is in Waco. That's going to be a little later in the fall. It's going to be on November the 8th from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. We're going to have that one at the McLennan County Community College, and we will wrap that one up with a free lunch. So like I say, free to attend. You're going to get a copy of the leasing handbook at those. So keep that in mind as well. Last couple things I'm going to mention, and then if we have questions, I'll sure try to answer them. So get those in the chat box. Here's the website that I mentioned. It's my Texas Agriculture Law blog. The website's agrilife.org/TexasAgLaw. You'll see a tab there that says Published Materials. That's where you can find the handbook and anything else I've written. Upcoming presentations, that's a tab where you can see where I'm speaking next, and it has info on those leasing workshops. The other thing I'll mention I have is a podcast. If y'all are podcast listeners, you can listen to this for free on your computer at that address at the top, aglaw.libsyn.com, or you can listen on your phone. We're on iTunes or any of your podcast apps. Every episode I interview an ag lawyer about a different topic. We've done everything from estate planning to water law to business entity selection. The one coming out next week's actually on grazing leases, so good timing there. Here's the last slide. There's all of my contact info. If y'all have questions or need info, I am more than happy to provide you that. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here, and I'm going to check the chat box and see if we've got any new questions that I have not answered.
Thank you, Tiffany. I think the one question that kind of scrolled off the screen was how many animal units, how many sheep equal one animal unit?
So I saw that question, and Gene may know better than I do. The chart that I have, which was put together by some folks at NRCS here in Texas, says 6 sheep. Gene says it's 5. You guys better double check that. I don't want to give you bad information, but I did double check the chart in the book, and it says that it's 6. But double check that.
So I'm scrolling through here. I guess as I scroll through here, look at the questions. One thing I will say and see what you think is I lease part of my land out for hunting, and one of the specific things that I put in there is where they can have open campfires, because the last thing I want them to burn down my place.
Absolutely, your place or your neighbors. And so a lot of leases up here in the Panhandle, I think we're all still a little jittery after some of the fires we saw last year. A lot of people up here will prohibit any sort of open flame. All right. Well, like I say, we sure appreciate you guys being here. If I can get you any additional information, let me know. I think Pete's got a survey to pop up here on the screen.
Yes, and the one question that we had earlier is if your slides going to be available.
Yes, if anybody wants copies of the slides, shoot me an email or give me a call and I'll get those to you.
And I posted a link to the survey, and I'm gonna pop it out. In the meantime, we had a couple of poll questions that we did not uh, share with the audience.
That's okay. I wouldn't worry about it.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and pop out the
Okay.
survey, and then again, if the survey covers up your screen, just click back on your little green looking icon and get you back into the webinar. And again, I will say is please answer that. All questions are anonymous. Our next session is going to be on September the 6th. Spray equipment setup, reduce drift and save money. Dr. Josh McGinty is going to be our speaker. And for those that need CEU, we'll have one CEU on drift.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. I appreciate you attending the webinar. If you would take a chance and fill out that survey, it's pretty quick. You just click a couple of little boxes, and that gives us some good information. Thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thank you all for attending. And if you're not following us, you can follow us on Facebook, Facebook/TX Range. We try to post these webinars and 2 educational posts per week. So be sure to follow us there. Tiffany, thank you. It was very, very good.
Thank you, Pete. I appreciate it.